All right, so now we want to get to the form. We want to have a form where we can actually add a new feedback item with a rating and some text. So let's go ahead and create in components a new file called feedbackform.jsx. And from here we'll create a React component. And for now I'm just going to output the word form just so we can bring it into our app.js and see it. So we'll just copy that down, and this will be feedback form, and then we're going to put this down here in the container above feedback stats. Okay, so now it should be outputting form. Good. Now, let's see, first thing we want to do in here, I want to bring in the card component because I want to wrap the form in a card. So let's do that. Let's go up here and import card from shared card, and then we're going to replace this div right here with the card component and pass whatever we're going to pass in here, which is not going to be that, so we can delete that. I want to start off with just the text input because we'll have the rating select, which will actually be styled checkboxes, or I should say radio buttons, but I want to do that later. So we're going to start off with the text field. So let's add, let's first of all create our form. We don't need an action. And then I'm just going to have an H2 here that says, how would you rate your service with us? So if we save that, we should see that on the screen. Good. Now underneath that H2 is where our rating select is going to go, but I'm not going to do that just yet. So I'm going to put a comment here and just put a to do, and this is going to be the rating select component. Okay, so we'll go under that, and then we're going to have a div with the class of input-group, because this is going to have our text input as well as our submit button. So in here, let's add an input with the type of text, and we don't need the name and ID. We can get rid of that. Let's add a placeholder, and for the placeholder we'll just say write a review. Save that. Good. And then right under that input we're going to have our button. Now the button is ultimately going to be its own component, because if you want to use a button somewhere else, I want to be able to have a button component where you can pass in a specific style, and you can pass in different props to it. But just for now, we'll have a button with the type of submit, and we'll say send. Now, we talked about component level state, and typically when you have a form, you're going to have a piece of state for each input in that form. So for this text input, I'm going to go ahead and set a piece of state, and to do that we need our useState hook. So let's import useState from React, and then let's set that down here. So we can choose to call this whatever we want. I'm just going to call it text, and then the method or the function to update this piece of state will be called setText. And remember, we want to basically destructure that from useState, and the default value for this goes in here, which I'm just going to have as an empty string. Now I want to basically connect this input to this piece of state, this text. So as I type in here, whatever I type in needs to be put into that piece of state. So I'm going to add an event onto this input. So we're going to say onChange, which is an event handler for whenever we type something in, this will fire off. And we're going to have it call a function called handle text change. Okay, and then we're going to go up here and we're going to create that function handle text change and set that to an arrow function that takes in an event parameter, because we need to get whatever's being typed in. So we can get that. Let's just do a console log, and we can do e.target.value. That should give us what's being typed in. So if I open up my console now, and let's go to console, and I start to type in here, we're going to see that log in the console. Now we want to set that to this piece of state, and remember we have this function called setText now that we can use, so we simply need to call that here and pass in what's being set. And then in addition to that, we want to add a value to this input of text. Okay, so we shouldn't get any errors if we reload. And I just want to show you, if I open up my React DevTools, our components here, and let's make this a little bigger for a second, you can see if we click on the feedback form, we can see that piece of state. And if I go and I type something in, now that whatever I type in is being set to that piece of state. Okay, so we'll go ahead and just close that up. And now we have our text state, which is hooked to this input here. Now in the next video, I want to create our button component. Before we go on to being able to submit it and being able to create our rating select, I want to have our button component, because we are going to have some validation here where the button will be disabled until we have at least 10 characters, and then the button will become active. We'll also have a little message down here that will tell us that it needs at least 10 characters. So in the next video, we'll work on creating a custom button component. All right, so in the last video, we started working on our form, our feedback form. I want to create a custom button for this form. And in this button component that we create, you'll be able to use all around the application if you want to use it somewhere else. And we can have certain props that are passed in for styling and so on. So under our component shared, because this is something that can be used anywhere, we're going to create a new component called button.jsx. And let's scaffold out a React component. And then this is going to take in some props. So we're going to destructure some props from this. We want children, because we're going to be wrapping the component around whatever the text for the button. So that'll be the children. We're going to pass in a version. So basically we'll have primary or secondary, and that will pertain to a specific class. We're also going to have the type, so if it's a submit button or just a regular button, and then we'll have is disabled, and of course that will, if it's set to true, then the button will be disabled. If it's not passed in, then the button will be active. So in here we want the children, so whatever the button component is wrapped around, whatever the text is. And then as far as the button attributes, we want the type to be set to whatever the prop is, the type prop. And then disabled, we're going to set that to whatever is disabled is, which will be a Boolean. And we'll add our prop types in a second. And then we're also going to add class name here, and we're going to set that to template string. And that's going to take in the BTN class, because I always want that class. It's basically just the basic button padding and all that. But then I have, actually we can just check it out real quick. If we look in our index CSS, and we should have some BTN, so that's the core BTN class, but then we also have BTN primary, which is this purple background color, and BTN secondary, which is this pink color. So what I want to do is take whatever the version, this could be either primary or secondary, let's close that up, and we want to add here BTN dash, and then we'll have whatever the version is, which could be primary or secondary. So it's going to add that class conditionally. Okay, now for default props, let's go down here and let's say button.default props, and we'll go ahead and set these. So version, I'm going to have that set to primary, meaning that's what it'll be if nothing is passed in. And then type, it'll be just button if nothing is passed in. And then is disabled, we're going to set that to false by default. Okay, so if you want this button to be disabled, you have to explicitly pass in is disabled equals true. And then prop types, we might as well add those. So let's bring in prop types, and then we'll go down here and say button dot prop types. So we have children, which is the node. So that's going to be prop types dot node, and that's going to be required. So we want to do is required. And then let's see, we have the version, which is a string. Okay, and that's not required. The type, actually we'll just copy this down. Okay, so the type is going to be a string as well. And then we have is disabled. So is disabled is going to be a Boolean, so we want to do prop types dot bool. So now we're ready to use this. So let's go back into our feedback form, and we're going to bring in our button component. And remember, that's in the shared folder. So we want to bring in button, and then where we have our regular button down here, we're going to replace this with our button component. So you want it to be an uppercase B. And then as far as the props that are being passed in, well, we're going to pass in the type of submit, and then let's pass in the version. Actually, we don't need to pass in the version because primary is the default, but I just want to show you that we can pass in secondary. And if I save that, now you can see that we get this pink button because secondary is being passed in as the version, and that's making it so we have a class of btn secondary, which in our global CSS is a pink button. Now, if we don't pass in a version, then the default will be primary, which is a purple button, and that's what I want. So I'm actually not going to pass in version, and now we get the purple button. Okay, and you can add more classes and more colors, and you can make this more customizable if you want. So before we get to the submission and before we get to the rating select component, in the next video I want to handle the validation, because I basically want to disable this button until we have at least 10 characters typed in. We'll also have a little message that will tell us that as well. Alright, so that's what we'll do in the next video. Alright guys, so now we're going to add some real-time validation. Basically, when we come to this page, I want the button to be disabled, and I don't want it to be enabled unless we have at least 10 characters typed in here. We'll also have a little message that will say it has to be at least 10. Alright, so we're going to add a couple new pieces of state to this component. I'm going to copy this down twice. This first one is going to be called btn disabled, and we want this to be set btn disabled, and like I said, I want that to be true by default, okay, when we come to the page, until we type in at least 10 characters. The second piece of state here, or I should say the third, is going to be the message that's displayed. So let's say message, and let's set that to set message to change it, and that's just going to be an empty string. Now before we do our validation, which we're going to do inside this handled text change, let's just go down here, and for the button, remember that can take in a prop called isDisabled, and I'm going to set that to whatever button disabled is, okay, whatever that piece of state is, which is true by default. So if I save, that should be disabled by default. And it's gray because I have some CSS styling for disabled buttons in the global CSS file. And then the message, I want that to display down here below this input group div. But I want to put this in a conditional. I want to make sure there is a message. So we'll say if there's a message, then let's have a div with the class name of message, and just close that div, and then in here will be the actual message. Alright, so whatever is in this message state will output under here. In fact, if I put a default here, if I just say hello and save, that's going to show right there. But we want that empty by default. Now we want the validation to run whenever we type something in. So we're going to go above where we actually set the text value here, and first check to see if the text is equal to nothing. So if the text is equal to nothing, we want to call set btn disabled and set that to true, right? Because we want it to be disabled. And then message, I want that to be set to null. And the reason for that is if there's nothing in here, there's no point in showing the message. I only want the message to show if we're typing and it's less than 10. Okay, now we're going to have an else if for our second condition here. And what we want to check is to see if the text is this time not equal to nothing. So if there's something in the text, and we want to check to see if it's less than 10 or less characters. So and the text, and we'll go ahead and just trim any white space, and then say dot length. So if the length is less than or equal to 10, then again we're going to want the button to be disabled because it's still less than 10. So let's just do that. And then for the message, let's do set message, and we'll go ahead and output text must be at least 10 characters. Okay, and then else So if there's at least 10 characters and there's something typed in, then we're going to set message to null. And then we want the button to be enabled, so we're going to do set btn disabled to false. Okay, and then we'll be able to, set text is just going to make it so that when we type something in, text is changed to whatever's typed in. So let's save that, and this is disabled. And then if I start to type, you'll see I get this text must be at least 10 characters. When I hit over 10 characters, that goes away, and now we can submit. Okay, submit doesn't do anything yet, but we're going to get to that. So in the next video, I want to add our rating select. Right now I just have this to do here. We basically want to have our numbers 1 through 10, which are actually going to be styled radio buttons that we can select, and then we can put in some text if we want, and we can submit the form. So we're going to start on that next. Okay, so now what we want to do is add our rating select component. Because right now we just have the text value, text field here. We want to have the select of the numbers 1 through 10 for the rating. So first thing I'm going to do is in our feedback form, let's add a new piece of state for the rating. So I'm going to copy this down, and I'm going to have it be 10 by default, and this is going to be called set rating to change this, and the actual piece of state will be called rating. Now down here we just have a comment, but this is where we want to put the select rating select component. So let's create that component. So we'll create a new file called rating select.jsx. Put that in your components folder, and let's say React functional component, and then for now we'll just output rating select and just bring it in to our feedback form. So up at the top here, let's import rating select, and then we're going to put that where I have the comment right here. So we'll just get rid of this and put rating select. Okay, and we should just see this rating select output. All right, so let's close up the sidebar here, and in the rating select we're going to have a piece of state that represents which number is selected. So we do need to import use state from React, and let's go above the return here. Let's say const, and we're gonna call this selected, and then set selected, and set that to use state. And again, we're gonna have 10 as the default. Now, as far as the output here, the JSX, it's going to be a list, an unordered list of radio buttons that are going to be styled to look like these circled numbers here, and that's all from the global CSS file. So I'm going to paste this in, and I'll just go ahead and save it. Now we're going to have this handle change is not defined because each one of these radio buttons has an onChanged event handler that points to a function called handle change. So let's just create that so we don't see that error. So handle change, that's going to take in an event parameter, and we'll just leave it empty for now just to get rid of the error. So now you can see we have all of our radio buttons which are styled like these numbers. So basically each one is an input with the type of radio. We have an ID of num1, and then the next one is num2, and so on. The ID value matches the HTML4 value for the label. Remember, in JSX we can't have a for attribute. We need to use HTML4. And then the actual value of each one is just 1 through 10. We have the onChange event handler, which is firing this function, which right now does nothing. Checked can be set to true or false. And what we're doing is we're just seeing if selected is equal to whatever the current input is. So if selected is equal to 1, then checked would be true. For this one, selected equals to 2. We happen to have selected equal to 10 because that's what we set as a default. So that's what checked is set to here, or checked is set to true here. So if I were to change this to like 5 and save, then 5 will be checked by default. Now, the only thing we have to do here is when we actually click on this, that's firing off this handle change, then we want to call set selected and change it to whatever's passed in. And we can get what's passed in. Let's do console log e dot and then current target dot value. That's going to give us the actual number selected, or the value selected. So if I open up my console here and I click on 2, you'll see that it's going to show 2, 4, 9, and so on. Now, this is going to be a string by default, so I can actually show you that if we use type of here. If we console log the type of, it's going to be a string. I just want to change that to a number, and I can do that simply by adding a plus sign onto this. So now if I save that and I click, now you can see that that's going to be a number. So let's get rid of the type of, and all we want to do now is call set selected, and it's going to be set to whatever we select. And then we need to somehow get that value up into our feedback form, because that's where we're actually going to submit the form. So what we'll do is, where we're embedding rating select, we'll pass in a prop of select, which will be a function. All right, and just for now, let's we'll just have a function here, and we'll do a console.log, and this will take in a rating, and we'll console log here rating. All right, now this prop, let's save this, and this prop is now being passed in, which is, we need to catch that right here. So select, and that's a function, so we're going to call that right here, select, and we're going to pass in whatever the selected value is. All right, so now I should be able to click one of these. Actually, you know what? It's going to show me the last value. Let's just take this. Instead of passing in selected, let's just take that. And then we should be able to, let me just reload this. Yeah, so now if I click on 2, it logs 2, 7, and so on. So what's happening is we're calling this select function right here, which is being passed in as a prop, and when that's fired off, this is happening. Okay, passing in the rating, and then we're console logging. Now instead of console log, we want to then set the rating in the feedback form. All right, so we'll save that. And now whenever I click, in fact, we can look at our dev tools here, go to components, and if we look at feedback form, we want to look at our state, and you can see 3. So 3 is selected right now. If I click 6, this state changes to 6, and so on. All right, so now whatever I click in here in this rating select component is going to set the rating of the feedback form. So now we're able to get the feedback form rating. We're also able to get the text. If I type in here, you'll see that gets passed into the state, the text state of this component. So now we're ready to submit, right? We just add a submit handler, and then we can get the rating, we can get the text, and then we can add a new feedback item. All right, so that's what we're going to do in the next video. All right, so now we're ready to submit our form. We're able to set the rating and set the text. We have those as state values in our feedback form. So now let's create an event handler for submitting the form. So we're going to say on submit, and let's set that to a function called handle submit. And then we're going to put that up here. Let's say const handle submit, and that's going to take in an event parameter. And since it's a form submit, we need to just call e.prevent default to prevent the default behavior, which is submitting to the actual file. And then I still want to check to make sure that it's 10 or more characters. Even though we have this kind of real-time error checking, you can still make this button enabled through the Chrome tools and then submit it. And because there's ways around it on the client. So let's just go ahead and do another check here and say if the text dot trimmed value, if that length is greater than, we'll say if that's greater than 10, then we want to proceed to do whatever we're going to do, which in this case is construct a new object called new feedback. And we want that to have the text, and we want it to have the rating. And this is just a shorthand for doing this. So basically we're just setting an object with the text as the key, and then this is the value from the state, which is connected to the text field. Okay, same thing with the rating. And as a shorthand, we can just do that. So let's just create that object, new feedback, and then let's go ahead and just console log it. Whoops, console log it. All right, so let's go ahead and open up our console here, and I'll just select 9, and then we'll say this is a test, and then we'll send, and you can see it's logging the object with the rating and the text. So now we want to call a function in our app.js, because that's where we're holding our global state right now. Just like we have a delete feedback, we want to have an add feedback here. So the way we'll handle this is where we embed the let's see, the feedback form. Just like we passed in this handle delete equals delete feedback, we're also going to pass in here into the form handle, we'll call it handle add, and set that to a function called add feedback. And we're going to just create that add feedback up here, const add feedback, and that's going to take in new feedback, and we'll just leave that empty for now. Now this handle add, we need to pass in to feedback form as a prop. So up here, feedback form, we'll destructure this, and let's say handle add. And then down here, instead of console logging, we're going to call handle add. And then let's just clear up the text field afterwards. So we'll just say set text, and we'll set that to an empty string, just so after we submit that goes away. All right, and then let's just test it actually by in this add feedback console log here. Not new, we want to console log the new feedback. So let's just reload this, and then I'll choose, let's say 8, and we'll say another test, send, and now we're getting that logged from add feedback. Now I do want to add an ID to this, because right now you can see it's just a text and a rating, and I do want to have an ID, and there's a few ways we could do this. I'm going to use a package called UUID, so I'm going to go ahead and just open another terminal here and npm install UUID. And we'll use that to generate a unique ID for each of our feedback items. Okay, and then let's go into our app.js, and we'll bring that in up here. So we say import, and the way we import this, as the documentation says, is we can do v4 as UUID v4, and that's going to be from UUID. So now whenever we want to generate a new ID, we can just call this UUID v4 as a function. So let's go down to our add feedback, and we have this new feedback object coming in. So what I'll do is I'll take that new feedback object and just add an ID to it and set that to UUID version 4 with parentheses, and then that should add an ID. So let's go ahead and save that. And then let's try this again. I'll go ahead and choose a rating and say this is a test, and we'll submit. And now you can see that in addition to the text and the rating, we have this ID. All right, cool. So now we just need to add it to our app level state. We need to add it to our feedback, and we do that with set feedback. Whenever we want to manipulate this state, whether it's deleting, adding, updating, we're going to call set feedback. So let's call that set feedback. Now remember, the state is immutable. We can't just like push onto it. We have to basically make a copy of it. So what I'll do is set this to an array, right? We want to get the current feedback items that are already there. So I'm going to use the spread operator and then take all the feedback that's already there and put those in here. So basically we're taking all the objects that are already in feedback and putting it into this array. In addition to that, on the front of it, I want to put the new feedback. Okay, so this is going to now set feedback to an array with all the current feedback items and my new one. And then that should get added to the UI here, because again, these items are coming from the feedback, the global state. So let's save that. And then let's just reload this, and we'll choose 9. We'll say this is a test. Let's send. And now you can see that that gets added to the global state, it gets added to it gets added here. The stats update, so we now get 4 reviews, and the average of the rating will also update. So our entire application reacts to that global feedback state. So in the next video, I actually want to show you how we can add a little bit of animation to our list right here. I want to have it fade in and out. And we can do that with, well, I mean, there's a lot of different libraries we can use, but we're going to use something called Framer Motion to be able to make it fade out when we delete, because right now you can see it just pops out, and when we add it, it just pops in. I want to have a nice fade effect, so we'll do that in the next video. Alright guys, so this video is completely optional. I just thought it would be cool to add a little bit of animation, so we'll have a nice fade effect when we add and remove a feedback item. And we're going to be using a library called Framer Motion. Now, version 5 was just released, and I did run into some issues. I had a weird error just by importing Motion like this. So what we're going to do is install a specific version just so we don't run into any issues. If you want to install the latest version and try it out, that's fine, but we're going to install version 4.1.17. So let's go ahead and jump back into our code here. And where we're going to implement this is in the feedback list. Remember, that's where we loop through and output each feedback item. So that's where we want to implement this animation. So let's install Framer Motion. I'm going to open up my terminal down here, a separate one from where my server is running. And I'm going to npm install framer-motion, but like I said, I'm going to do a specific version. We're going to do at 4.1.17. Okay, so we'll get that installed, and then there's going to be a couple things that we need to bring into our feedback list. So we want to import, and that's going to be from Framer Motion, and what we want to bring in is motion and something called animate presence. And then let's close that up. Down here, I'm just going to copy this return and comment this one out, and then paste it above, just so you have the version without the animation. So here we want to wrap the list, so this feedback.map, we're going to wrap that in animate presence. So that's the opening tag, and then we'll come down here and we have our closing tag. And then within the map, so right above the feedback item, which is what we want to animate, we're going to add a motion div. So we want to add that and then close it down here. And then we'll just tab that over. And then motion div, this has to have a key because this is a list, so we have to have a unique key, which I'll just use the item ID. And then let's just put these on separate lines just so you can see what's going on here, because we need to pass a couple things into this motion div. So the first is going to be initial, and we're going to set that to double curly braces because we're passing in an object. And we're going to set the opacity to 0 because that's the default. We want this to be invisible to begin with, and then we want to fade it in. So initial is opacity 0. Then we want animate, and we're going to set that to an object with opacity 1. Okay, we want to animate it to be visible. And then we also want to fade out, so we're going to set an exit, and that's going to be set to opacity 0 because it's going to go invisible on exit. All right, it's going to fade out. So let's save that. And now if we come over here and we were to delete one of these, instead of just popping off the screen, it does a little fade out. And if we add something, let's say this is a test, if I add this, now our review, our feedback item fades in as well. Okay, so it fades in and it fades out. And you can mess with the different properties. There's different types of animations. I'm not going to get too deep into it. I just thought it would be a cool little thing to add to the project. And again, if you want to try the latest version, you can do that. I just ran into some weird errors, so I figured we'd just install the last version. All right, so that's it. Let's move on to the next video.